with reason, measure with science, act with ethics, reduce the pain, increase the joy, humanity remains.
How Norman Borlaug saved 1 billion lives. Imagine walking down a quiet street today, passing a man sitting casually at a coffee shop without giving him a second glance, completely unaware that this person, backed by cold, undeniable empirical data, literally saved your life, your father's life, and the lives of roughly 1 billion other human beings from starving to death. We are not talking about a cinematic superhero wielding a glowing sword, nor a career politician delivering an impassioned speech at the United Nations General Assembly. We are talking about an unassuming American plant scientist who spent decades kneeling in Mexican agricultural fields under a punishing sun, re-engineering seeds grain by individual grain. His name was Norman Borlaug. The human experience is undeniably littered with moments of chaotic mismanagement and sheer planning stupidity. Yet when the human mind decides to focus its contextual data and purge all logical fallacies, the result is a scientific miracle known as the Green Revolution. Most people naively assume that human survival is a matter of luck, or that the overwhelming abundance of food on supermarket shelves is a default law of nature. History tells a radically different story. History reminds us that we were a single step away from a catastrophic global famine in the middle of the 20th century were it not for one man who insisted on placing scientific data and mathematical logic far above human emotion, thereby rewriting the foundational conditions of human survival.
Chapter 1. The Malthusian Myth and Impending Global Hunger. During the 1940s and 1950s, the Western civilized world was gripped by a state of intellectual and existential panic. Western academic and political elites had fallen victim to a brand of fatalistic pessimism rooted in the economic theories of the 18th century scholar Thomas Malthus. The prevailing consensus was utterly bleak. The global human population was growing at an exponential rate, whereas agricultural food production was expanding at a mere linear crawl. Simple arithmetic, when interpreted with superficial panic, dictated that humanity would inevitably devour itself. By 1968, the American biologist Paul Ehrlich published his infamous book, The Population Bomb, opening with the absolute declaration that the battle to feed humanity was already over and that hundreds of millions of people across the Indian subcontinent and Africa would starve to death during the 1970s with no force on Earth capable of preventing it. Here, we observe a textbook collapse of the academic community into the false dilemma fallacy, wherein society was presented with two artificially constrained options: forcibly restrict human population growth or accept mass die-offs. They trapped humanity inside a closed equation, completely ignoring the reality that the primary variable in the system, technological and scientific innovation, is never a fixed number, but a dynamic force capable of exponential scale. Norman Borlaug was born in 1914 on a modest farm in Iowa. Raised with a pragmatic work ethic, he was never obsessed with political fame or academic prestige, possessing instead a sharp, analytical intellect built on rigorous observation, critique, and empirical deduction. After earning his Ph.D. in plant pathology from the University of Minnesota in 1942, he was offered a far from glamorous assignment in 1944. Relocate to Mexico as part of a joint initiative between the Mexican government and the Rockefeller Foundation, tasked with aiding impoverished Mexican farmers whose wheat yields were being decimated by poverty and disease. In the 1940s, Mexico imported the vast majority of its wheat, while Mexican fields suffered from a devastating parasitic fungus known as stem rust or Puxidia graminis, an organism capable of turning lush green crops into blackened, brittle stems in a matter of days. When Borlaug arrived in Mexico, he encountered a broken agricultural ecosystem alongside an extraordinarily complex set of contextual data, depleted soils, primitive farming techniques, and an agonizingly bureaucratic research establishment. The traditional experts of the era had succumbed to the appeal to ignorance fallacy, assuming that high-yield wheat had never been successfully cultivated in Mexico under such harsh conditions. Doing so was a biological impossibility. Borlaug, operating as a true scientific rationalist who refused to accept dogma without empirical proof, began gathering real-world data directly from the soil. He worked 16 hours a day under the scorching sun, manually crossbreeding thousands of wheat strains by hand. He recognized that the problem was not divine wrath or natural limits, but rather the genetic code of the wheat plants and the systemic flaws in how they were being cultivated. This marked the vital first step of a sound methodology, precise description of the problem, systematic critique of legacy assumptions, and the logical derivation of solutions that transcend artificial boundaries.
Chapter 2. Scientific Data and Structural Innovation of Semi-Dwarf Wheat. To appreciate the sheer scale of Borlaug's scientific breakthrough, one must break down the biological mechanics of the problem just as he did. Traditional wheat strains possessed tall, slender stalks. When Borlaug and his team began enriching the Mexican soil with heavy nitrogen fertilizers, an unexpected engineering failure occurred. The plants absorbed the nutrients and grew rapidly, producing heads heavy with dense wheat grains. However, because the stalks were tall and thin, they could not support the sheer physical weight of the grain heads. The plants collapsed under their own mass and fell to the ground, a catastrophic agricultural phenomenon known as lodging. Once wheat lodges onto wet soil, the grain rots, rendering the entire harvest useless. Paradoxically, the very inputs meant to maximize yields, fertilizer and water, were causing the total destruction of the crop. This is where Borlaug's logical clarity shone brightest. He deduced that the variable requiring modification was not the volume of fertilizer, but the structural architecture of the plant itself. He needed a wheat strain that was short, sturdy, and structurally reinforced to bear heavy loads without bending. In the 1950s, he acquired a Japanese semi-dwarf wheat strain known as Norman 10, which carried specific dwarfing genes. Borlaug systematically crossbred Norman 10 with his disease-resistant Mexican strains through years of painstaking manual hybridization. The result was the creation of semi-dwarf wheat. This engineered plant redirected its metabolic energy away from building uselessly tall stalks and focused it entirely into producing massive grain clusters atop a short, thick, unbreakable stem. Yet structural architecture was only half the battle. Borlaug also faced an agonizing race against time. Traditional plant breeding took years because wheat could only be grown once per season. To bypass this temporal bottleneck, Borlaug pioneered a radical technique known as shuttle breeding. The concept involved harvesting 2 generations of wheat in a single calendar year by physically shuttling seeds between 2 vastly different geographic and climatic zones in Mexico. The high-altitude fields of Chapingo near Mexico City during the summer, and the sea-level fields of the Yaqui Valley in Sonora during the winter. When Borlaug first proposed this methodology, he was met with fierce condemnation from senior scientists and administrative directors. They accused him of squandering resources and cited a sacred law of plant biology known as photoperiodism, which posited that crops adapted specifically to the daylight hours of their native latitude could not thrive if transplanted across different daylight regimes. His superiors warned him that the seeds would fail entirely. The academic establishment was committing a classic appeal to authority fallacy, relying on established consensus rather than empirical experimentation. Borlaug refused to yield to institutional inertia. He pushed forward with the experiment, resulting in a staggering biological breakthrough. The shuttle-bred wheat not only adapted seamlessly, but actually evolved a rare genetic trait. It became completely day-length insensitive. This meant Borlaug's engineered seeds could be planted and grown virtually anywhere on planet Earth, from the valleys of Mexico to the plains of India, Pakistan, or Egypt. By 1956, Mexico had achieved complete self-sufficiency in wheat production thanks to Borlaug's seeds. By 1963, a staggering 95% of all wheat grown in Mexico utilized his semi-dwarf varieties, and the nation's total wheat yield had quadrupled compared to when he first stepped foot in the country. The Mexican experiment was an unequivocal triumph, proving that rational problem-solving could transform desolate conditions into unprecedented abundance. However, the true test of this scientific framework would not take place in North America, but thousands of miles away across the globe. Chapter 3: India and Political Tactics for Human Survival. By the mid-1960s, the Indian subcontinent, comprising India and Pakistan, was standing on the precipice of a historical catastrophe. Severe back-to-back droughts struck the region in 1964 and 1965, exacerbated by geopolitical conflicts and fragile infrastructure. American grain ships were arriving in Indian ports on a daily hand-to-mouth basis simply to prevent immediate mass mortality, while Western policy analysts routinely published doom-laden reports asserting that catastrophic starvation was statistically unavoidable in the Punjab and Bengal regions. At this terrifying inflection point, Norman Borlaug, alongside the visionary Indian agricultural scientist M.S. Swaminathan, initiated a massive campaign to import and deploy Mexican semi-dwarf wheat seeds directly into India and Pakistan. But the path to implementation was blocked by a wall of bureaucratic inertia, local academic jealousy, and deep political paranoia. Indian government officials hesitated to import foreign seeds, while local scientists committed the confirmation bias fallacy, actively searching only for data that supported their entrenched dogma that local native varieties were inherently superior, entirely ignoring the immediate reality that millions of citizens were starving in the streets while native crops failed systematically. Borlaug engaged in a relentless political and administrative brawl. He confronted politicians who delayed credit authorizations and berated bureaucrats who allowed seed shipments to sit rotting in port warehouses. In 1966, after extraordinary personal intervention, hundreds of tons of semi-dwarf wheat seeds were loaded onto ships in the largest mass seed transfer in human history at the time. But the rollout was plagued by chaos. The shipment faced dock strikes in Los Angeles, and the 1965 war between India and Pakistan broke out while the seeds were en route across the ocean. The seeds arrived under artillery fire, and early planting in experimental fields was literally carried out under the headlights of military trucks amid the backdrop of war. When the harvest arrived, the results sent shockwaves through the global scientific community. The Mexican semi-dwarf wheat produced a yield unprecedented in the recorded history of South Asia. By 1968, the Indian harvest was so overwhelming that local infrastructure completely collapsed under the weight of abundance. Schoolhouses, community buildings, and granaries were commandeered just to hold the mountains of harvested grain because official storage silos were overflowing. India's wheat production surged from 12 million tons in 1965 to over 20 million tons by 1968. Pakistan achieved total self-sufficiency in wheat production in the exact same year. Analyzing this intervention through a strict decision-making framework reveals that Borlaug executed a masterclass in rational ethics. First, he gathered precise, unvarnished contextual data directly from the field. Second, he executed a radical scientific intervention by re-engineering the structural and genetic constraints of the crop. Third, he subjected the action to the ultimate ethical filter, securing human survival and ruthlessly minimizing acute physical suffering. Prior to Borlaug's intervention, mass starvation was treated as an inevitable outcome, threatening the survival of entire societies. By prioritizing the absolute reduction of immediate human pain, the agonizing death of starvation, over bureaucratic protocol and academic vanity, Borlaug protected the continuity of human civilization across an entire continent. In 1970, Norman Borlaug was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. It was not a prize in biology, but in peace, because the Nobel Committee recognized a fundamental truth: human beings cannot build peaceful societies or rational institutions on empty stomachs. As the chairman of the Nobel Committee remarked, Norman Borlaug has given wheat to a hungry world, and in a hungry world, bread is peace.
Chapter 4: Ethics, Critique, and Decisions of the Modern Era. Despite saving an estimated 1 billion people from starvation and malnutrition, Norman Borlaug and the Green Revolution faced severe criticism in the decades that followed. Environmentalists and modern academic commentators began condemning the long-term ecological consequences of industrial agriculture. The heavy reliance on synthetic chemical fertilizers and pesticides, the depletion of underground aquifers due to intensive irrigation, and the loss of agricultural biodiversity stemming from large-scale monoculture farming. This critique offers a fascinating case study in retrospective decision analysis. Many modern detractors fall victim to the slippery slope fallacy and the guilt by association fallacy, arguing that because industrial farming creates ecological side effects, the Green Revolution itself was a flawed or catastrophic decision. This perspective suffers from a severe lack of historical context. When Borlaug made his decisions in the 1960s, the real-world contextual choice was binary: either adopt high-yield agricultural technologies immediately or watch hundreds of millions of living human beings starve to death in real time. In a rational ethical framework, the imperative to prevent immediate mass mortality and preserve human survival holds absolute priority over secondary ecological optimizations. Rescuing 1 billion people from a horrific death is a non-negotiable moral necessity. The resulting environmental challenges, while undeniable, represent a new set of contextual data that requires new scientific engineering, not retrospective regret over having saved human lives. Borlaug never denied these ecological trade-offs. He addressed his critics with characteristic rational bluntness. Responding to Western environmentalists, he famously remarked, "Some of the environmental lobbyists of the Western world are living in luxury in northern cities, speaking comfortably about the dangers of chemical fertilizers while holding fridges full of food. If they lived just 1 month amid the misery of the developing world, surrounded by starving children, they would realize that hunger and poverty are the most devastating polluters of human dignity on Earth." Furthermore, critics frequently overlook a profound ecological phenomenon known today as the Borlaug hypothesis. This concept demonstrates that by dramatically increasing crop yields on existing farmland, Borlaug's technology effectively prevented millions of square miles of wild rainforests, valleys, and natural ecosystems from being cleared for low-yield traditional agriculture. Had Borlaug not engineered high-density crops, humanity would have been forced to deforest vast portions of the Amazon and tropical Africa simply to cultivate enough food using primitive methods. Thus, Borlaug's rational engineering not only preserved human civilization, but indirectly saved the broader biosphere from agricultural devastation. Borlaug remained relentlessly active until his death in 2009 at the age of 95. Even on his deathbed, his final spoken words were focused on expanding agricultural technology into sub-Saharan Africa to eradicate lingering hunger. He never sought immense personal wealth, nor did he demand monuments in his honor. He left behind an enduring blueprint demonstrating how a single human being, armed with cold scientific logic and stripped of ideological fallacies, can alter the trajectory of human history. Conclusion: a rational lesson in engineering human survival. The story of Norman Borlaug is far more than a historical biography of a dedicated agricultural scientist. It is a masterclass in the philosophy of human survival. It stands as definitive proof that success and failure on this planet are neither products of blind luck nor preordained fate, but the direct consequence of how we gather contextual data and process it through rigorous logic. When the global community in the mid-20th century surrendered to fatalistic Malthusian rhetoric and logical fallacies that deemed mass starvation an unavoidable reality, it took a relentless methodology built on observation, critique, and logical inference to redefine the biological limits of human productivity. True ethics do not consist of high-sounding slogans shouted from comfortable podiums, but of decisive, high-stakes actions aimed at maximizing human survival and mitigating acute suffering. Borlaug demonstrated that when science is liberated from bureaucratic dogma and intellectual vanity, it can overcome the most daunting natural and geopolitical crises. By taking the grim contextual data of a world on the brink of famine and altering a single genetic variable within a grain of wheat, he engineered an entirely new reality that continues to sustain generations of human life. History is ultimately shaped not by those who lament reality or passively await catastrophe, but by the cold, rational minds that enter the arena, gather the facts, reject prevailing fallacies, and execute decisions anchored in an unshakable commitment to human life. Norman Borlaug proved that a true hero of humanity does not need a weapon or an army. Sometimes, all it takes is a short stalk of wheat and an unwavering determination to keep the world alive.